Josh, thank you very much for doing this. You are not in this book, this fine volume that we're using for the class, so we can't presume that the students have heard of you. So who are you and what do you do?
My name is Josh Greene, and I am a professor in the psychology department at Harvard, but my roots are very much in philosophy. My undergrad degree was in philosophy, and my PhD is in philosophy. I got into the science of moral judgment and decision making, including the neuroscience of morality, really as a philosopher. And my thinking was that if there's a way out of some of the most intractable debates that we face in ethics and perhaps in philosophy more generally, if there's a way out, it probably has to do with understanding our own psychology better. Where do these competing moral intuitions come from that make us unable to reach a satisfying conclusion about some of these big questions? And so I got interested in uh, basically the psychological and biological origins of our moral thinking, partly because it's fascinating in its own right, and partly because the thought is that having some insight into ourselves might help us resolve these moral questions. Not in a sort of, I think there's often a caricature that you're going to do some scientific research and then it's going to prove that Kant was right or Mill was right, and that's just silly. But understanding yourself and your own thinking can change the way you think. And I think that's true in general. And I think that's true about ethics. And that's what my life as a philosopher scientist has really been about.
Okay, so you're here because it occurred to me that over the last few weeks, and indeed the week coming up, we have essentially been studying the philosophy of Josh Greene. So you've written on many topics that we're talking about in this class. In particular, you're very well known for your study of trolleyology, the empirical investigation of various kinds of trolley problems. And I believe that you first came across the trolley problem when you were in some famous seminar at Harvard with Robert Nozick, who actually we're going to be reading next week, Alan Dershowitz and Stephen Jay Gould. Just out of
Yeah,
interest,
yeah.
what was that? What was that class
It
like?
was this big class called Thinking About Thinking. It was in the biggest auditorium in the Science Center at Harvard. It was kind of a hodgepodge of things, but it introduced me to the trolley problem. And I thought this was fascinating, just as a puzzle in its own right, but also because I thought that it really condensed the biggest question in normative ethics down to its essentials, right? I mean, you have the consequentialist or utilitarian view that says what really matters is consequences. Ethics is or should be about doing as much good as possible, and everything else flows from that, sometimes in complicated ways. And then you have the Kantian perspective that says morality is not just about producing good consequences. There are certain duties that we have that may or may not produce good consequences, but they're just what you have to do. And then there are corresponding rights. There are certain things that you cannot do, no matter the consequences, because it would violate somebody's rights, perhaps treating them as a means only and not as an end or something like that. Putting off to the side the other major Western perspective, the Aristotelian perspective, which I think of as actually, for practical purposes, more aligned with the Kantian perspective, although not everyone would agree with
Right.
that.
In the class, we haven't talked about Aristotle on ethics, and the main opposition has been between the consequentialist on the one hand and the deontologist or the Kantian on the other.
Right. But the idea of rights and duties versus the greater good is really nicely captured by these trolley cases, where you have the switch case, for example, where you can turn the trolley away from the five and onto one. And most people say that it's at least permissible, maybe obligatory, to turn the trolley so that you don't have five people dead instead of one. But then when it comes to pushing somebody in front of the footbridge and using them as a trolley stopper, that seems wrong to most people. And I had that pair of intuitions as well. And I wanted to understand in myself and other people, what's going on here? And if I could understand that, then maybe that would give me some insight into this broader philosophical question. And then that led me to do both neuroscientific research aimed at understanding the kinds of cognitive processes that are pushing in one direction versus another, and also behavioral experiments, trying to see what exactly we're sensitive to when we're making these judgments.
Okay, so you did some quite famous experiments involving fMRI on the trolley problem to see what was going on in people's brains when they evaluated the switch case or pushing the, well, in my class it was the dense man. It was originally the fat man, and then it was the man with the heavy backpack, but I made him very dense.
Yes,
okay. Okay, so could you just briefly tell us about those experiments and the conclusions that you came to, or what you found?
So the idea, so this sort of hit me when I was an undergrad. I read this book called Descartes' Error by Antonio Damasio, who's a neuroscientist who's famous for studying emotion and decision making, among other things. And he described these patients who have damage to a part of the brain called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And these people, their sort of general reasoning abilities remain intact. They do pretty well on IQ tests and things like that, but they have these emotional deficits that affect their experience and their decision making. So if you show them a picture of a gory car accident, someone who acquired this damage later in life would say something like, I used to be really upset by stuff like this, and now I don't feel anything, but I know this is a bad thing, right? And various things like that. And this got me thinking that, maybe what's going on in the switch case is we're really just thinking about this using our general reasoning abilities, better to save more lives. And that leads to a kind of consequentialist response. But when we encounter the footbridge case, there's something about that very basic act of violence, pushing the guy off the footbridge, that triggers an emotional response that competes with that basic cost benefit reasoning. And so my first original prediction, which was actually later confirmed by other researchers, was that patients with this kind of damage, they would be like everybody else on the switch case. They would say it's better to save more lives. But on the footbridge case, they wouldn't have that negative feeling, but they would still have the cost benefit reasoning. And so they'd be more likely to say that it's okay to push the guy off the footbridge. I didn't have access to patients, neurological patients, but I did encounter Jonathan Cohen, who was just setting up a brain imaging center at Princeton to get at psychological questions. So I said, okay, well, we can do a brain imaging version of this. And so we did that first experiment, and the results were kind of what we expected, but also reflected things that we only later years began to understand about brain networks. But our interpretation of those results, which they were consistent with, but complicated, was that indeed it's consistent with the idea that there's an emotional response that makes you say no in cases like the footbridge case, that competes with cost benefit reasoning, and that you can see these competing responses in different parts of the brain. Later, Damasio himself and others tested those patients, and there you get the really clear brain results. The patients who had the damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, they were 2 to 3 times more likely than other people to say that it's okay to push the guy off the footbridge and things like that. And then more recent studies that I've done and that other people have done have sort of provided more details about the nature of the circuit that's responsible for that emotional response, and the other response grounded in more general cost benefit reasoning. And a lot of behavioral experiments have explored this in different ways. But the basic idea with all of this is that there are really 2 different dissociable responses at work here that depend on different parts of the brain, although they converge on some parts, and that you can press different cognitive levers and move people's judgments around consistent with the theory.
And this is a bit ironic historically, since it's the Kantian who tries to ground morality in rationality.
That's right. And it doesn't, it doesn't prove that. I mean, I'll be Kant's defense lawyer now. Kant was not making a claim about human psychology. So Kant was aware that people's, or everyday behavior and judgment was driven by sentiment, but he thought that from a normative point of view, that essentially moral truths could be deduced from first principles like mathematical truths, right? And so on the one hand, it's not by any means a knockout blow to Kant to say, look, people are making these judgments that are Kantian in flavor based in a more emotional way than the other side. But it does raise the possibility, which I explore more in my book and some of my other more philosophical writings, of a kind of debunking argument about Kant, that we can still say, okay, but what's the most plausible interpretation of what Kant is doing? Is he really working out the truths from first principles? Or is he basically taking certain emotional responses that he and other people have and trying to rationally justify them? In other words, is Kant really a rationalist, or is he a rationalizer? And so this was an argument that I made in this paper called The Secret Joke of Kant's Soul, which is basically arguing that the best understanding of what Kant and Kantians are up to is that they're really rationalizing their emotional responses. It's not a proof, but it's saying this is the most plausible explanation of what's going on. And then if that's right, then that raises questions about, okay, well, how seriously should we take this normative theory, and so on and so forth.
Okay, great. So you already mentioned your book, which is Moral Tribes, which is quite recent, right? It came out a couple of years ago.
Depends how old you are. It came out in 2013. So.
Oh, 2013. Oh, right. Okay. I thought it was more recent
to you
than
and
that.
Me, but to your students.
I guess I only read it recently. Right? Time goes by so quickly, of course, the older you get. Okay, so I'll provide a link to that, and then also the link to the Secret Joke paper. Isn't that a quote from Nietzsche?
Yeah, so Nietzsche said, I think I've got it mostly memorized, Kant wanted to prove in a way that would dumbfound the common man that the common man was right. That was the secret joke of this soul. He wrote against the scholars and in favor of popular, he wrote against the scholars and in favor of popular prejudice, but wrote for the scholars and not for the people. Essentially, he's taking everyday judgments about, don't lie, don't steal, and as I like to point out, don't masterbate, and then provides,
yes.
a kind of
I have not
arcane rational proof for these things.
I have not mentioned Kant's views on masturbation, which,
that's right,
given the events of the last week, may be not so absurd, but
right.